have in terms of someone like Jesus is that he doesn't care about his body. He doesn't care about the emotions that are created by the interaction of his body and the physical environment. Let me give you an example. Imagine if I was to say some really, really mean things to you. And let's say you were to get really worked up about them. And you stand up and you come to me. And maybe you punch me. Maybe you slap me. Maybe you kick me. Or maybe you just pack up your stuff and leave. What have you done? You allowed someone from the outside to create emotions inside you. So I become the creator of who and what you are. And your body carries the emotions that I create. Okay? Jesus is beyond all of that. And in fact, most of, if not all of the prophets and the sages are about that. Moses the same way, Muhammad the same way, the Buddha the same way. They don't really care. If someone, for example, it's an issue that sometimes I encounter when, say, people come to my class or when people come to my office and they say, I'm married, I have a boyfriend or a girlfriend, my relationship is not going well. Can you help me? Now, the problem with that question is you're not the only one or the first one on this planet who's ever been in a relationship. Relationships have been around for thousands of years. If you want to know what your relationship is, how your relationship is, and why it is the way it is, you have to understand the anatomy, the structure of a relationship. Okay? So the first thing that happens, let's say, Stan, you come to me and say, my wife and I are not doing well. Is there a way out of this? Can we fix this? There is something about us, there's something about you as an individual that needs to be in a relationship with someone. And depending on your sexual orientation, let's just say you're heterosexual. You need to be with a woman. That's just the way you're wired. Okay? You need to understand that. Is relationships about escape from loneliness? Absolutely. Do we have need to talk to someone in moments of despair? Absolutely. Do you need sex? Absolutely. Do you need conversation? Absolutely. You and I are not monks living somewhere in some cave, trying to be self-sufficient without having any needs like God. We are regular chaps trying to survive life the best we can. This is the first thing you need to understand. That you, as an individual, you need to be in a relationship with your surrounding. Okay? Now, initially, of course, you want to have a relationship with a bicycle. You want to ride it. Okay? There comes a point where you want to hold hands with someone. It's not sitting on a bike, it's holding hands with someone. Okay? The other thing you need to understand is you, Stan, are an enormously complicated animal. You're very complicated. Okay? You have to, in your short time in life, you have to figure out the needs of your physical body. And as you age, the needs become more complicated. In a couple of weeks, you got to get hip surgery. Okay? So you need to have a good amount of knowledge about how your body works, what's good for it, what's bad for it. Okay? Then as you move up, you become a bit more complicated because your physical body lives in a social world. And the social world creates emotions inside you. And the emotions are not going to be, for the most part, pleasant. It's going to be one of struggle. Every single, you have to figure out how to function in this world that's there to brutalize you on a daily basis. Now, understanding emotions is very, very difficult. Why? Because initially when emotions come to you, they consume you. It's like if I piss you off, you become consumed with anger. And you're going to say some nasty things to me. And then you're going to walk out. And you're going to be boiling in anger. And then about 12 o'clock, 12:05, as you're sitting and having your food by the pool, you're going to say, Stan, what the hell is wrong with you? What happened? And the point is, you need some time to remove yourself, whatever that may be, from the emotions. So now, like a helicopter, you're standing up here, you're looking at the emotion, trying to understand. Okay? Now, if you come to class every day for the next 10 years, and I keep creating negative emotions inside you. What you have is now the creation of your psychology. Whenever you walk into any class, you're going to imagine it's Amir Sabzavari teaching. I'm going to walk into this math class and I'm going to get upset. I'm going to take a yoga class and the yoga teacher is going to make me upset. So I have leaked into every part of your life. Okay. So you have to understand the trauma. And the problem with psychological stuff is that they have history. And you have to go back in time. And it's really, really tough. And for the most part, it's painful. Also, it's very dark. It's places that you and I have never visited. So there's a good chance that you're going to hit your knee here, hit your shoulder, then it's going to be painful. You're going to say, ouch, and you're going to come back out. Say, it's too much for me. You know? And then you have an intellectual part to you. The problem with this is that your intellect tries to figure out what your body needs. It tries to figure out what the hell is wrong with you emotionally. It tries to figure out the psychological aspect. Okay? So your physical body lives in an environment where all these things are created. So most of your life and my life are going to be spent figuring out these ridiculous things. Important. Okay. Someone like Jesus, for example, says, this is Jesus, for example, okay? Now, some people are born to be like him. At the age of 12, he says, you know what, I don't think I'm interested in any of this stuff. Some people, and most people are like this, most people are like the Buddha. And it's much better to be the Buddha than to be Jesus. Okay? Because Jesus doesn't know what it means to be married. And Jesus doesn't know what it means to have a child. And Jesus doesn't know what it means to be in love with your parents. And Jesus doesn't know what it means to be in love with your culture. Okay? So when someone comes to him and says, I'm having difficulty with my marriage, he says, the world is it's a den of thieves. Why the hell would you want to keep your marriage? Just follow me. I'll get you the kingdom of God. If you go home, you'll have the kingdom of your wife. But do you prefer God or wife? Okay? Now, the Buddha does something very interesting. The Buddha has parents that he loves. So there is parental love. The Buddha gets married. So he loves his wife. The Buddha has a son. He loves his son. The Buddha is born in Nepal, or let's just say India. He loves his culture. So what you have is a man who's in love with his land, in love with his parents, in love with his wife, and in love with his son. And when you fall in love with someone, what you have is attachment. What you have is attachment. What happens to him is this. He one day wakes up and he says, what is the benefit for a man to gain the whole world but lose his soul? He has that desire. That voice comes to him. Should I stay or should I go? See, Jesus never had to struggle. He just left. Or maybe he did struggle, we just don't know about it. But the story of the Buddha, and there are some doubts as to whether or not he actually existed. Okay? He may also be a figment of someone's imagination. But besides that, it's a great story. Why? Because he says, I want to leave my parents. I have this calling. Something from my inside says, life should be more than this. I hear this whisper from the kingdom of God. I don't know what that is. I don't know where that is. But I can't sleep well. I can't eat well. My conversations with my buddies, they fall apart. I don't find them interesting. I look at my father. I'm no longer interested in the things that he says or the things he wants to give me. I look at my wife. She's a nice woman. I don't enjoy sex very much. I don't enjoy being around her very much. I don't really know why. She hasn't done anything bad to me. In fact, both my parents and my wife have been profoundly kind, and yet it is not enough. I feel insufficient, incomplete. Then there is a son. And it's not like today, Stan. It's not, 3,000 years ago, when you have a child, you are 100% devoted to your kid. Because your wiring is cultural wiring. As a mother, you quit your job and you serve your husband, you serve your child day and night. As a father, you serve your parents, you serve your wife, and you serve your kids day and night. That's the way the culture is. Okay? Now, this is the mapping that we were going to talk about the other day, but since we're here, let's just talk about it. So this is what we call the physical life. And remember, in the physical life, don't dismiss this and don't villainize and demonize this, because in the physical life, you do find meaning and purpose. They create emotions. They create psychology. And you try to, with the aid of your intellect, figure out some of the issues you have in your culture, some of the issues your parents may have, some of the issues your wife may have, some of the issues your son or your children may have. Okay? So remember, your intellect is not in the service of understanding or knowing God. It's in the business of figuring out what to do with all the complexities of social life, physical life. Okay? Now remember, if someone says, my son is not doing well in school, you can't take him to Jesus, because he doesn't understand fatherly love. I'm not talking about God and human being. I'm talking about a regular guy like you, having a son, and your son is doing drugs, and you say, please. And after a while, you find yourself helpless. You can't take him to this guy, because he's going to use language that is foreign to you. He's going to use language that's not reachable to your son. He doesn't understand what the hell he's talking about. You want someone who's been there, who's done that. Okay? Now, what happens at this stage, if you have this calling, and the calling has to be sincere. In other words, by sincere, I mean the following. Sometimes you eat a sandwich and you drink some water and you realize what you really need to drink to push your sandwich down is Pepsi. Because the fizz, it does something to the sandwich, it does something to your digestive system, everything gets processed really, really quickly. Okay. There are times where you're driving and on the radio or on the billboard, there is an ad of Pepsi Cola. And then you pull into 7-Eleven and buy yourself a Pepsi. So you have two different kinds of calling or desires. One that is organic and one that is manufactured. Okay? This is very, very important, because if it is organic, there's a good chance that you're going to pursue the desire until you reach it, and then ultimately you're satisfied, with some luck, hopefully. If, on the other hand, it is manufactured, there's a good chance that you're going to read the Bible, you're going to go on a spiritual quest, not because you wanted self-knowledge, you just didn't want to deal with your wife. Okay? Let me give you an example, if I can. I had a friend many, many, many years ago. His child was not doing too well. He had many disabilities. And the doctors couldn't do much for him. It was beyond what the doctors could do, or where we are right now in our knowledge of the physical body and what we can and can't do. They told him, though, that his son will die in like 2 years or 3 years or 4 years, because the disease is very progressive and eventually will just, eat him alive. The son was 10, then 15, then 20. And I don't know if you know any parents who have disabled children. Their life really is it turns upside down. It's very, very difficult. Add to it, you live in a system where the insurance companies are not there because they care for your kids or they care for your disease. They're there to make money, and they'll do whatever they can to make money. In fact, Matt Damon, I think some years ago, made a movie where he was a lawyer trying to fight an insurance company because this kid was sick, but the insurance company refused to pay, and he took them to court and he won. It's a great movie. I don't know what the movie is called, but it's worth watching. And when his son was 20, he came to realize that he just needs help. He can't trust the insurance companies. He can't trust his wife. He can't trust his kids because it's tough. It's tough, raising and taking care of a disabled child. So he began to read the Quran. And he began to read other sacred texts in hopes of understanding themselves, understanding life, understanding God, becoming more patient, becoming more forgiving, all those things. The things that you and I desire. Even though the doctors had told him that his son would die at the age of 5 or 6, the son lived to be 47, and then he died. In the 30 or 40 years of living with this disabled child, my cousin read everything. He had a love affair with books, sacred books, to understand things. When his son died, he was freed. He was no longer interested in reading. He could not go out there and party. And so sometimes I see him maybe once a year or so. So I say, Hussein, what's going on? How are you doing? Have you read any books? What books? Oh yeah, I know I'm no longer interested. Why? I'm just not. And you realize that because your son is sick and because the sickness of your child impacts you on a physical level, emotional level, it creates trauma inside you and your life. And all you do is you think about how to cope with all this stuff. Your only foundation, the only place you can go to find some air to survive is by reading books. Now that the child is gone, it's done. So, and that's the reason why I say it's important that you start your quest, any quest, knowing how it began and why it began. Okay? Because otherwise you're going to spend 20, 30 years doing something, eventually you come to realize you're not really interested. It makes you a better human being, don't get me wrong, but you were really not interested in those things. You were interested in how to cope with all this stuff. Then you find someone's very, very healthy, like the Buddha, like Muhammad, like Moses. Okay. Now, if you're allergic to the Buddha, we can cross him out. If you're allergic to Muhammad, we can cross him out. But Moses you will like because it's the Old Testament. Jesus is the new Moses. Jesus is the new Adam. Okay? So ultimately, if you like Moses, we can talk about him. Okay? What does Moses have? Moses is born in the cradle of comfort. Forget, those few weeks where he is on this basket floating on water. He's picked up by Pharaoh's sister. He's given everything. So much so that Moses believes that in fact he is a prince. And when the Pharaoh dies, it's either Ramses who's going to take over or Moses himself. And because Moses happens to be relatively humble, a decent human being, the Pharaoh has a tendency of looking at him differently. Okay? Now, remember, there is no dysfunction in his life. He is healthy. His slab, his concrete, has no cracks. And so he has a house resting on the slab, and the house is really good. At this stage, something really interesting happens. It's what we call luck, if you believe in luck. If you don't believe in luck, you can call it fate. It doesn't really matter. But what happens is Moses just happens to be at the right place, right time. Okay? he hears something very strange. Moses, what's the possibility of you having the blood of the Hebrews, not the Pharaohs? Now, see, for example, if I was to tell you, Stan, have you read the Gospel of Judas? You should read it. Now, what's going to happen to you is this. You're going to say, here we go again with that nonsense. Once the class is over, you will never think about the Gospel of Judas. Sometimes you find people in a very, very interesting environments, inwardly speaking. I say, Stan, have you read the Gospel of Judas? And for some strange reason, there is an opening inside you. You keep looking at the clock. It becomes 10:45. Usually you walk to the library. This time, you jog to the library. You run. And you go to the front desk and you say, I'm looking for the Gospel of Judas. And you read it. And again, because you're in that space, the Gospel of Judas does amazing things to you. Really? Are you telling me that in the Gospel of Mark, Judas was not completely evil? Are you telling me that there are two ways that Judas dies in the Gospels? In one Gospel, he hangs himself. In another Gospel, his belly opens and he just dies? Are you telling me that as the Gospels move on, the character of Judas becomes more and more and more evil? And then you begin to examine your position about the New Testament. Who wrote it? Why is it written this way? And all of a sudden, your entire narrative about who you are as a Christian and the Bible turns upside down. All because of this. You happen to be in the right place, right time, where things go inside and things begin to change. Moses is told, could you be a Hebrew? And it makes him question things. Could I be a Hebrew? Well, what proof do you have that I'm a Hebrew? There is this cloth. It belonged to you. And I, in fact, saw Pharaoh's sister picking you up from the basket. So when you have your life in order, and when you're in the right place and right time, okay, and you're around the right people, sometimes what happens if you go through this thing called the call. Call. Now, this is not a call from the outside. See what happens if you have a cell phone, for example, and it suddenly rings. Okay, everything disappears except the call. You look at your phone, you pick it up, you say hello. This is no different. You come to a place where you say, kind of like what happened to you when you said, I no longer want to be an addict. Okay, you had desires for 20 years, but this time you got a call. This call is very different than all the other like ring and hang up. Okay, this was like a tornado. Stan, you're getting older. Stan, you've lost enough. Stan, wake up. Okay, this particular call does something really strange to you. It forces you to look back and be disgusted. Your self-hatred begins, and this is very productive. Without a good dose of self-hatred, there is no progress. And this self-hatred has to do with you being forced by this call to look back and say, who's on the other line? And it says, I'm your past. Look yourself in the mirror. What do you have? You don't have a house. You don't have a car. You live in a tent. You got no friends. Your food is smoking. Your drink is smoking. Your girlfriend is smoking. Your parents is smoking. It's enough. Now, the call by itself is not enough. It is a force, okay? But it's not a force that you can control. It's not a force that you can guide because this is new. And this is going to combat a 30-year history. This has happened to you. Gradually it has snowballed. It has taken this call to come to you after maybe 20 years. It calls, hangs up, calls, hangs up. This time it calls and it doesn't hang up and it stays with you. What happens now, you wake up. You wake up, see the past, and you have emotions you don't like. At the same time, this particular waking up pushes you into, I want to change. You have the map to the past. You know where to go to have fun. But you don't know where to go to make the proper changes, so the past becomes irrelevant. So when you get a call, okay, you go on this thing called the search. Usually the way we function is this. When you have a call, all these questions come up. All these emotions come up, and you're disturbed. I mean, it's like a tornado. Everything is turned upside down. Because you've never been up here, and because you spend a good amount of your time down here, to look for answers, you go down here. Now, the risk of going down here for answers is that they could occupy and entertain you for another 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And this call that came to you as a tornado, it slowly just dies. And it becomes a nice, mild breeze. But to change, you need a tornado, you need a hurricane. Okay? The search, what makes it difficult is because for the first time you're asking questions you've never asked before. And if you've asked before, you've never really been serious about them. You know, as you get older, you have no choice but to think about death more often. It pushes you to evaluate your life, to see what's valuable, what's meaningful, what's worth doing, what's not worth doing, with whom it's worth having a conversation or even an argument. When should you be passive? When should you be active? And then you're going to start thinking about what are you going to leave behind? And what happens to the people that you have left behind? It's a very strange thing, you see. And then you realize these are not questions or things you were thinking about in your 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. The things you were thinking about is, I'm sorry, Professor, what are we going to talk about today? Oh, it's ethics? Okay. Is there a book I can go and read? Okay. There's always maps and signposts down here where you should go, what you should do. But when you come to this place, there are no maps. Okay? Now you go down here to ask questions from your buddies, your parents, your therapist. Nobody knows. There was a guy when we were at the car wash, forgive me, Lena, his name was George. He was this big, tall, very, very strong 70-year-old Mexican guy. Man, he was a beautiful man. He used to come to the car wash with his truck with his wife. Then one day he comes and he's just depleted. Something about him has been hollowed. I said, George, what's going on? My wife passed away over the weekend. And he just starts crying. And he used to cut trees for us and other people in Roseville. And then he shows up after 2 weeks. Says, George, where have you been? He says, I was driving one night and all of a sudden I saw my wife right in front of my car. You know, and I turned the wheel and I hit a tree and I came out, my wife was standing there. And then all of a sudden she disappeared. I went to my pastor's house and I knocked on his door and I said, this is what happened. How do you explain it? And he says, the pastor didn't know what to say. I read books, didn't know what to say. I called my friends, didn't know what to say. And all of a sudden you realize this is a man who knew what his life was about. He loses a wife. He still knows what his God is all about, what the Spirit's all about. He has an experience, but he has no answers. He reads the Bible, no answers. He goes to people of authority, no answers. And he's left all alone. When you go on a quest, on a search, no one can accompany you. It's an inner journey, and it's horrifying. It's depressing, because this is the only world you've known for the past 30 years.
You know, my question was, what am I going to do being clean and sober? That was my question.
Well, there are a couple of things. As you're trying to become clean and sober, that's not really what you think. You're focused on being clean and sober. Then there comes a point where you have been clean and sober for a while. Then what happens is your mind goes into the future and looks at Stan as someone who's clean and sober and says, well, if Stan can't hang out with his buddies, can no longer do what he used to do, what is Stan going to do? Okay. Now, when you get to that point, I think, and I may be completely wrong, I don't know, I think other forces will enter into your life and just will make possibilities. You know the saying that knock and the door shall open? When you knock on this door, when you say, I want Stan to be sober and clean, behind this door, there are all these other doors. And once this door opens, all these other doors will open as well. Now money comes to you easy. Food comes to you easy. Friendship comes to you easy. Talking about your past comes to you easy. And there is not a hint of shame or guilt about you when you talk about them. In fact, you're very, very proud when you say, I used to be an addict. Why? It empowers you. It says, I was a sinner, now I am righteous. But I couldn't be righteous without the sin. So I think if, for example, you're sitting here and you're saying, well, I'm going to get my PhD in philosophy. What the hell am I going to talk about? We do that sometimes because when you're doing when you're a student, say at Laney, and you're thinking about getting your PhD, you look at yourself and say, I'm incompetent. I raise my hand. I want to ask a question. And I fumble around. I have no idea what I'm talking about. Everybody gets confused. I get confused. My instructor gets confused. In this condition, am I able to go in front of the classroom and talk before an audience of 50 people? We think about that. But what happens is you're like a sponge. 15, 20 years of school, you have all this information inside you. You walk into a classroom, something happens to you. All the information with some experience, you're able to connect ideas and then you shine. Or maybe you just suck, but it makes a good, income and you can pay rent and food and all that stuff. Lena and then Charles.
I was just wondering, you mentioned the whole being supported by these physical things like people and being at the right place at the right time. What do you feel like the social and physical environment needs to be in one's life in order to answer that? Does it need a specific environment?
A couple of things. I think you should go and visit. I'm not quite sure what gospel it comes from. Okay. That human beings live in two worlds. You occupy the world of Caesar, money, rent, food, going to school, getting A's to transfer to San Francisco or Yale or whatever, get married, maybe you have children, take care of your parents. That's the world of Caesar. Pay attention to it. Your body is important. Pay attention to it. You also occupy another world. And that's the world of God. Okay? Now, the sort of desires that live inside the world of God is very, very different than the desires that live inside the world of Caesar. And these two things, they can't be married. They can't unite unless you are really, really, really good. And by good, I mean the following. If you know how to make chicken, if you're a good cook, okay? If you're not very good, what you do is you just put some salt and pepper on the chicken, you put in the oven, and it cooks. If you're really good, you stuff the chicken. You put turmeric, salt, pepper, garlic, various kinds of other seasonings. You put it and it comes out. Man, it's GQ chicken. And you eat it and it's delicious. If you happen to be like the Buddha, again, not Jesus, like the Buddha. Why? Why is it better to be like the Buddha than Jesus? Because most of us, we suffer from difficulties of social components, racism, poverty, homelessness. I don't want to go to a homeless man and say, you don't live by bread alone. Here's a Bible.